So hello everybody, my name is Nicola Baldwin and I am co-chair of the audio committee of the Writers Guild. Today we are celebrating two things. We are celebrating Shôn Dale-Jones and his play Cracking, and also that it's 20 years of the Tinniswood Award. The Tinniswood Award has been going since 2003, and it was created in memory of Peter Tinniswood, who was a prolific writer for television and for radio. I actually printed before this meeting. I thought I'll just have a little look on his radio plays. There's 40 plays for radio. There is well over 60 episodes. There is characters being created that he worked on in books that he then wrote for television and for radio, and then also wrote an incredible selection of, I imagine, monologues for radio based on Enoch Powell, the local paper person, just characters, just little sketches of people around in the times. And the Tinniswood Award was created in his memory by his family. I think possibly Steve Tinniswood may be with us today, and the Writers Guild and the Society of Authors, and they jointly administered the prize, and the prize money comes from the Authors Licensing and Copyright Society, ALCS. Looking back over the plays, since it's been going, there's 21 writers who have won the Tinniswood Award, and that actually breaks down as two sets of writing teams where it was two people working together. 1 year where the prize was divided between two different writers, and Stephen Wyatt, who has won the prize twice. Looking at the plays, they are a remarkable catalogue of high quality, fascinating, original radio drama. And I was trying to think if there was anything that I could detect in common amongst the plays. And I think what they do share is they kind of share a uniqueness. They share a sense in which they all attack the form of radio itself with relish. And they each, in their different ways, seem to be trying to wrestle through the form to find a new way of storytelling that is both personal but also formally really exciting. And I think that's certainly true of Cracking. There's other things that I want to say in relation to Peter Tinniswood and his work, but I think those things will probably emerge in our conversation today. And what I do want to say based on the above is that Cracking is absolutely a worthy winner, and you can see, and when you hear it, and I hope most of you have heard it, you can see why. It was, however, a good selection of shortlisted plays, and I just want to name check those. It was also Scooters, Shooters and Shotters by John Russell Gordon, About a Dog by Hugh Brentnell, and there was also Ghosted by Lindsay Sharman, and then, of course, Cracking by Shôn Dale-Jones. So Shôn, congratulations. Do you want to start by telling us a little bit about, I know you've worked in theatre, you've done audio plays, something, no particular route or direction in this, but just something about your work for people who might not be as aware of it as we are.
Yeah, sure. So I started making work mainly for theatre. And initially I was more of a writer performer, as in an improviser, I guess. So about 30 years ago or so, I started a company with my wife and fellow actors. And the way we made our live performance work was through, improvising and devising and co-creating. My journey as a writer sort of started maybe 15 years ago or so. I started to, sit down with a pen and paper and write words down. And I think that was really because I started to realize the more performances I did live on stage, that the story was becoming increasingly more important to kind of hold the whole performance together. And I started getting more and more fascinated by stories and storytelling. And I started writing radio around that time, actually. So the first radio show I made was a show called Floating, about the Isle of Anglesey floating away from mainland Wales before returning back to the exact same position as it had started, which is an event that did happen in 1981 when we were looking at the Falklands War and nobody really picked up on what was happening in Anglesey. But that's a story for another day. And that show was originally made on stage, and a producer from BBC Radio 4 approached me and asked if I'd like to adapt it for the radio. And yeah, and I haven't really looked back since. And I think really the thing that fascinates me the most is, I guess, this sort of weaving between the real and the imagined. So I think that sort of has always been and still is my sort of biggest source of sort of fun. I really enjoy taking an audience on a journey that sort of starts out very clearly either in one camp or the other. So obviously the story of the Isle of Anglesey floating away from mainland Wales is clearly real. And then I tried to convince people that it could be a fantasy. And so, yeah, and so with cracking, I think hopefully, yeah, that kind of interweaving sort of begins to happen at a certain point in the show as well, in the radio play. But I think that feels to me as if that's my main
Yeah.
sort yeah, my main sort of enjoyment.
So it's like the storytelling and how you put stories together works across different media. You find new things in each of them and still exploring how the story comes out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's right. So yeah, I've done a little bit of screen work as well. I've made low budget films, and yeah, and very much enjoyed still doing live work as well.
I'm just going to ask you something because I just spotted in that moment that Steve Tinniswood has joined us, and there's something that I thought about in relation to cracking that's quite interesting in relation to Peter Tinniswood as well, of him having grown up in Liverpool, but obviously lived, and I think you spoke to Steve and other relatives on the night of the award night, lived in Cardiff. And I know that you obviously grew up in Anglesey and you live now in Bristol and you've lived abroad. Um, we were talking about it a bit before we came on air, as they say, but just that idea of, what you're exploring, when you're writing about a place, but you're creating a story from it. Is that something that's a recurring thread in your work too?
Yeah, definitely. I always end up on the Isle of Anglesey. And I think that landscape of the Isle of Anglesey and all the towns and villages on the island, yeah, have so many stories for me, stories that arrived, from the day I was born, I guess. And I think the more I kind of look back on things, I realize that my father especially was a big storyteller. And he used to kind of relish in telling stories wherever we were, whether it was the front room or on car journeys. And he really enjoyed telling tall tales. And those tales that he told were set in those landscapes, whether it was on beaches or cliff faces or fields. And so I think in a way I've just sort of carried on the tradition. But it's true that I sort of, even if I have a story which might begin on a holiday in France, it'll end up in a small farmhouse in Llanfairpwllgwyngyll. It'll just migrate back home. And I think that's because I love that landscape and I can hear the voices of the people. And I think that sort of the way the imagination sort of comes to life in that landscape is what really sort of gives me the flow that I suppose we all need when we sit down to write.
Fantastic. Now, do you want to tell us a little bit about cracking? If you maybe tell us just briefly what happens, in the story, and then also the world of it. It's got such a powerful mood to it. And so if you want to say a little bit about some of the ideas that went into the making of it.
Yeah, sure. So central to the play, I guess, is this event, which is the event of me cracking an egg on my mother's head. I'm in my mid-50s and my mother is 83. And so that's, I guess, an unusual thing to happen between two people of that age and maybe in that relationship, mother and son. But that's the central thing that happens. And the background to that is I go to Anglesey to visit my mother because she's waiting for some test results from the hospital, and so her mortality is hanging over pretty much everything, which is something that obviously myself and a lot of my friendship group are kind of that's what's happening to us at the moment. That elderly parents, in obviously their final chapters of their lives. So that's been going on for a while. And then I guess what it's about the reaction to the event of cracking the egg on my mother's head that spins takes the story forward. And I guess, it's about the way in which people start to read that event as a piece of violence rather than as a piece of sort of fun. And I guess the culture that we're living in now, in terms of kind of cancel culture, and maybe in the world of comedy as well, like wondering what's funny and what isn't, and what needs to be readdressed, etc. That's obviously going on all around us all the time, and so that's really what I was kind of also wanting to explore. And I think that by putting the two things together, as in my relationship with my mother and the end of her life and the quality of that relationship, next to the problematic question of what's permissible, what's allowed now, what's difficult to say, how much censorship should there be? Having that going on at the same time just felt like a strong way of developing those two ideas together.
It builds up such a sense of dread and fear that you don't see coming from the beginning. I think it's and also, as I was saying to you just again before we came on, that I had to remind myself, I had to check with you that it was just mainly it's your voice going all the way through, because I think it's something about hearing a story, and it goes very to the root of what audio can do, of a world being woven around you, which you can hear a pin drop. It's just it's so vivid. Um, was that something that you discover as you go? And at what point do you discover it in a piece of work? Do a lot of writers will be imagining the words, or they'll be acting out the words, but because you're going to perform it, do you build the work as much as you write it, or are you surprised in the recording process by the way it develops?
No, I mean, for a long time, I've used recording my own voice, telling the story as part of the process. So I kind of will do it bit by bit. So I mean, I'll jump between writing and recording, and
Mhm.
sometimes I'll record exactly what I've written, and sometimes I'll improvise without any writing, and then listen to what I've said through improvisation, and then sit down and write it down. So that flow between the spoken word and I guess the kind of oral tradition of storytelling and the written word, that's I'm continually kind of ping ponging between those two things. And I should say as well, because I know that the award was given for the actual words on the page, the script. But in the process I used to make this, my friend John Biddle, who is the composer and musician, he was a big part of the process, because I would include him and his music, and we would talk a lot about the creation of the sound of the music as part of the whole process. And because I think what I've learned over the years is that once you bring music into the making of a piece, it really affects how you tell the story. It becomes like, part of the language. Music can sometimes help you kind of edit many, many words off the page, because actually the music is carrying some of the narrative, or taking us to an emotional place that we need to get to, and we get there quicker or more efficiently through the use of music rather than through the use of words.
It's fascinating. And in that process, were there things that surprised you? Were there things that you discovered about the story, or what sometimes you get a thing that things don't go where you expect them to go, even when you might have written drafts, recorded things already. Was there moments in cracking? Because it's such an intense piece.
Um, I think like, so there are different stories that go on within the piece, and one of the stories in the piece is the story of Gellet the dog. And I think when I found that, that was a really lovely moment of surprise, that we could take the story to that place for a moment. That sort of, yeah. I mean, that kind of place of mythology, and that place of sort of, deep kind of Welsh culture. And I think that when the more I sort of stayed with the idea of of the Prince of North Wales killing his beloved dog, without it being justified in any way. Because he falsely accused the dog of killing his baby son. It obviously made complete sense that is such a big part of what I was trying to kind of open up in the piece. And then in that landscape of the sound of the dogs and the wolf that he killed, we then actually found a lot of the tone of the music. And that was really exciting. And neither me or John, when we talked about the music, we were kind of wondering about the direction of the music, and were sort of starting to talk about westerns just because of the sort of nature of the wild frontier and rules being made and broken. And so we thought that was, but as soon as we heard the wolf in the story of Gellert the dog, we were like, oh, that was super exciting. Yeah.
Really interesting. And for how you make a show and for how you work with audio, how does that differ to how you might approach with theatre? And also because I know you've mentioned in the past, some shows start in one format, one medium, and then they move. What's that like for you? And what does that do to your working process?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think like if I'm making a live show, then I will make it in iterations, and each iteration I'll try in front of an audience. So, the kind of work in progress performances, which, lots and lots of people do now, they call them scratch performances or whatever they call them. But I do a number of these over a period of months leading up to the event of the show, the live show itself. And obviously with radio, that's much more complicated. I mean, well, I suppose there would be a version where I could do that, but because of the way in which I make radio with most often with BBC Radio is obviously there's a day at the end of the process where you record the actual show. And so to say to the BBC or whoever's looking after the production of the show, like, can we try out bits of the show as we go along? That would be yeah, that doesn't feel like an easy thing to pull off. Obviously, I'm sure I could find a way of doing it if I thought it through, but that's what I would say that's the biggest difference is that when I'm doing live work, I can test things out in front of audiences. And when I've made radio work, I've never been able to test things out. So you just have to just dive in, do the whole show and hope the audience are, responding to it and you're engaging them.
I think maybe that does contribute to the intensity and the sense of being totally immersed in the world of the play, perhaps, because I think it's true that with theatre there is, each night is different and things do respond to the room, don't they? And they move a bit here, they get a bit funnier, they get a bit quieter. But it's absolutely its own kind of statement. Do you carry a record around with you when you're kind of walking in the mountains and stuff, like a sketchbook, or do you just remember stuff really well?
No, I do that. I do that, but it's not. Yeah, I mean, obviously, not most, but a lot of people have smartphones, so it's just there, isn't it? But I do, yeah, use a lot of audio and video when I'm sort of out and about in the real world.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
And
interesting.
actually, the thing is like, like Mary Oliver, the poet, obviously, she was endlessly only walking. My impression of Mary Oliver is that she was only ever writing while she was walking and sitting down in the landscape. And it was such a beautiful thing to find out when I found out that's how she put her poems together. And it makes complete sense. I mean, if I could walk around all day and just sit down every now and again and write. For me, that would be the perfect way of working because, yeah, walking feels like a big part of thinking.
I'm just going to ask a question actually, it just popped up and it kind of relates to what we're saying of like how radio is less responsive in the way you make it. And it's a question from Peter in the audience asking if it's when you've made a piece of audio work, you've made an audio drama, um, does it surprise you? Is it hard to get an audience that responds differently from how you imagined? I suppose because there's no way of calibrating as you would in a live show of getting a sense of how it's playing, that you've made the piece of work and it's there. Maybe that's true of all pieces of work, actually, whatever format, but is there something about your relationship with the audience in audio that is different?
Um, Obviously, it's a very it's a really interesting moment when you know that the play is going out, is being broadcast, and the way in which this show went out into the world was very much in that old school tradition of like, and now this is the broadcast day, and so it's kind of old school in that sense. And then it is really interesting because then of course you receive reactions. People find you now, don't they? It's amazing. I have an Instagram account, and so they can find me there. I have a website, they can find me there, or they can find me through the BBC, etc., etc. So yeah, the reactions do come in, and they are sometimes surprising. I don't know how it is for other people, but sometimes you write something and something that wasn't in emphasis for you is in emphasis for somebody else. So when people I mean, when people are kind of concerned about my mother, it's very, very lovely. It's such a caring response. But of course, I know that my mother's in good health, and I know what she's, where she is pretty much every day, and so I don't have the sort of deep, deep everyday anxiety about her. But then suddenly, because on the day of listening, people are really anxious. Is she okay? What's happened to her? Yeah. So
I think
it's
that's because you are the play to that extent, because you are there and you are not only kind of performing in it, you are performing all the parts, you're telling that story. So there's a much greater identification between you and for if compared to if you wrote the play and they had actors coming in and doing it. So it's
yeah.
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's true. I suppose it's true. I suppose so. So the kind of personal aspect that I bring to the piece is then mirrored by the way in which people respond. Yeah, and then I guess yeah, no. So I don't think I've ever had from the radio work I've done. I don't think I've ever had like a reaction that's kind of completely sort of thrown me. I don't think I've ever made, something that I thought was very funny and someone said that's really not funny at all, or I find that really, I don't know, um, yeah, like what would the word be? Somebody who might find something, controversial when you don't, or something, or you've upset someone without thinking about it. About
Mm.
yeah, I haven't really had any of those on stage. Things do, it's different on stage. Different things happen, and the audiences feel each other's reactions. And I think in radio, even though we've done a few kind of listening together events, I think, on the whole, obviously, radio feels like something that people listen to individually. So,
Yes.
so that's a very different experience to a theatre audience coming together to gather around the same story.
That's very true, isn't it? That in theatre there is moods that can just take off like the weather
Oh
in
yeah,
the
yeah.
audience, because it's so different. And sometimes if you're working with actors, they'll come off stage quite traumatized by the way the audience have reacted to them that night.
Yeah, I mean, audiences can be incredibly powerful. They're a big group. If you're doing solo work, it's you and this huge group, and so obviously the first few minutes, all about bringing people into the narrative, into the flavor, into the tone of the show, and try to create the right atmosphere for the best experience to happen within. And obviously, you don't get that interaction in radio, and so yeah, so when you're in the recording studio, that whole idea, that I think on day one in the radio, someone said, "Well, you treat the microphone as if you're whispering into someone's ear," and that's been the best advice ever. That you do. So you really do imagine that when you're talking to someone individual, like you're talking to one person.
Interesting and good advice to pass on as well. When a story begins to bubble up, well, how is it for you, the writing process? Is it that some stories they're just there to you, or do you have to go looking for them? And whatever the process is, do you know what format you want them to be in? Do you think, oh, this is a radio play, this is a theatre play, or is it not like that for you?
So I am always writing. Um, so it's a daily practice. So stories kind of are always sort of bubbling around. Some feel more formed than others, but I think I'm always in the process of writing. And when I'm writing, I'm thinking about story. And so the story could work in any form. So I try not to overthink, oh, this is a performance, a live performance piece, or this is an audio piece, or this could be a screen-based thing. I try just to focus on what's on the story and on the people and what they're saying and where it's all going. Um, I mean, it is true that my sort of main kind of, I suppose I'm more accustomed to standing up and doing live shows as a solo performer, so that can happen quite quickly. But I try to, yeah. And there was the other part of the question, sorry, about the form and the.
Yeah, just at what point you kind of know what point it crystallizes, if you're working on
Yeah,
stories, what point you think, I really want this to be a radio play? Or
yeah,
if a producer says, what would you like to do? How do you know which one it is for radio? And I know because some shows have gone from one thing to another with you, haven't they, that you've worked on?
yeah. I've often made theatre work. Well, I say often. I think it's happened 5 or 6 times. So I've made a theatre show and then we've turned them into radio plays. And Cracking, I think, was only the second time I made a piece for radio first, and it does now exist as a live show. Um, and I think in terms of like knowing which story to focus on in terms of making it into a thing, into a show. I think something happened. So, for example, with this show with Cracking, um, so I actually I think like maybe 2.5 years ago I'd began to write a story about cracking an egg on my mother's head. And I don't know how the idea came into my mind. It just did. And when it did, I started writing a story more about how my family would respond, my siblings. I have two brothers and two sisters, and it started to talk more about a way in which we all treat man. And man, and it became more of a sort of, family drama about how we all treat the matriarchal figure and all this kind of thing. And it ended up with me being disinherited and going to live in a French monastery. And, but the story of cracking an egg on my mother's head really fascinated me. And then, so that was like maybe 2.5 years ago. And then about a year, about 2 years ago, so 6 months later, um, there was an incident in my real life which happened when some internet trolls did arrive on my doorstep, and accused me and my wife of doing something that we genuinely hadn't done. And so, it was really freaky and very, very frightening, to be honest. So I kind of laugh about it now, luckily. But when this event happened, it was such a sort of game changer. I mean, I felt like, our sort of, I don't know, our sort of emotional center had been knocked sideways. And as part of, I suppose, of sort of trying to process and understand and re-center ourselves, I started kind of trying to understand it. And so this interaction with these internet trolls, real life internet trolls, sort of then sort of started to become a story, and then I managed to grab the egg cracking story and put them together. So that was kind of fortuitous in a way.
It's kind of like the story was there when you needed it to kind of
Yeah,
find a way to, yeah.
it's weird, isn't it? I mean, because I like the question, like how does an idea sort of arrive? Because I think what I've sort of done, like I said, is just continually write every day, and just be patient and kind of and also be very aware that sometimes you're seeding something, sometimes
Mm.
consciously. So like for example, the project I'm like have on my desk at the moment. I started writing it like 15 years ago, and it's only now I'm going, no, no, now I have to write this. But it's really been going on for 15 years. So yeah, so that's how I go about it.
I was actually just going to make a note to ask you, but of course I can just ask you. The seeding process, I think, is that something that you've over time, is it something that you would say to younger writers starting out to trust that you'll develop that? You think, because I can recognize that there's things that they just pop up, but then they go away, but they're there. Do you consciously try and seed things? You observe things that are being seeded, or they just come when you need them?
Um, No, I think I think it for me it is just a continual daily practice, and I think I'm also got myself, and maybe it's the old days of improvisation, but that idea of like you don't know what you're doing. I'm very comfortable in that space. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm doing it anyway. So I'm not someone go, well, I can only sit and write if I know what I'm doing, if I know if I have a story, if I know I'm being paid, if I know blah blah blah. I'm like I that's not me. I just write. I mean, for the love of writing, I just love it. And so I write. without having any idea really about where it's going. And then over time, opportunities arrive, or a story kind of comes to fruition, and you feel compelled to tell it, or you send it to
Actually,
somebody.
I was going to say that brings us on perfectly to our next question that we're going to take, which is from Meg, who asks just if you could say something about the commissioning process. And maybe you could talk about the commissioning process in relation to cracking, but also how that works for you, how you like to work in that process for radio specifically, maybe.
Yeah, okay. So I would have definitely in the past been put off by commissioning. So what I mean is, like, I started this theatre company 30 years ago, and it was sort of done with a lot of faith in that I we will make something and somebody will put it on. And we did that for a long time. And the very first commission I got, it was a theatre commission, and I found it really oppressive. I felt like some contract had been made between me and the commissioner that I then had to satisfy. So I'm saying that just because I think yeah, it's really interesting to try to get your head inside, like, how does a commissioning thing work? So what I mean by that is, I think, like, I feel like I've made mistakes when you go, oh, these kinds of things are being commissioned. Therefore, maybe I should write something, that doesn't work for me at all. I think there's some wonderful writers out there who can just seem to write anything, it's amazing. They could write something about Henry VIII one day and then something about the future the next. So that's not me at all. So the commissioning process is quite delicate for me, because in a way I feel like I'd run 100 miles from a commissioning process, because I do find them to be quite onerous, and yeah, I just find them complicated. But luckily, and it is with, luckily that I kind of have managed to develop a process over time with the BBC. And I think in the beginning it was easier for me because they would commission the adaptation of a pre-existing stage play. So do you mean, so that wasn't so that took a lot of pressure off, because they were sort of, in a way, the commissioners in a way were purchasing something that was in existence. With cracking, I think I got used to pitching ideas, like ideas that I would come across in my own writing and think, oh, I wonder how this would go down, and then just kind of chucking them around to different people who I knew had commissioning pots, and saying, what do you think about this? And waiting for someone to say, oh yeah, I think that sounds good. We could put that in. So I think I'm on the kind of, I suppose that means I suppose I'm on the front foot with commissioning.
Yes, yes. I guess you're in the front foot, but you've already played around with the idea quite a bit. So it's not like, oh, I've just got to write 150 words about something that I might want to write in the future. And you haven't really engaged with it. It's got texture already for you by the time that you're getting to that stage, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm just going to ask something on behalf of Rob, who's in the audience, um, of whether you have got a favourite medium, if you are, aside from the fact that we're celebrating the Tinniswood and we're talking about radio, what's your, we won't tell anybody, what's your favourite medium?
Well, I mean, to celebrate radio for a moment, though, it is the most extraordinary form. I really do think it's the most imaginative place. And I love it for that. I really do, because because on a practical level, you don't have to worry about budget. On a time level, you can spend as much time as you like on it. And I think it's I really, really, really do adore radio, and I think you can also see it as the beginning of everything else as well. So what I mean by that, I think, if you start with radio, it can end up as a written word piece, as a novel, it can end up on screen, etc., etc. So I think it is a really brilliant place. As a view, as a person in the world, like, not making stuff, I mean, I love films. That's what if someone said, what do you want to do tonight? I say, let's watch a really good film. So I love films, and I would love to be able to, yeah, I have ambitions to write film. And then obviously, as a sort of I still love going on stage. It's still, nothing sort of beats the creativity of live performance. I think, like, when I'm on stage, I think I feel at my most spontaneous and most creative. And so what I try and do, I think, in terms of writing is take that, the spirit of that and the pleasure of that and the fun of that into my writing. So I will literally write with sometimes I literally write with lots of music on, and I try to
Yeah.
kind of create a setting for my writing as if I'm improvising.
Very interesting. Yes, that sense of it being this is an element of performance even when you're writing. I'm just
Yeah.
actually going back to some of the things that I was looking up about Peter Tinniswood as well about I think it was David Nobbs that said about him that he was a great stylist, um, and that had that rare phenomenon of being able to write lines that nobody else could have written. And I think that's that same thing. If he'd written that many plays, you yourself have written so much work that you just have a kind of zone that is, to other people it feels like being a great stylist, but it's just really finding your storytelling, what's the word, not fault line, gold mine, that you can tune into that and what you're doing. um
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the landscape of Anglesey as well, and I think when you talk about these veins that we kind of go into, and I do think there is something going on there, absolutely. There's something about crossing over the Menai Bridge and landing on the Isle of Anglesey that makes me go, oh, this is it, this is everything, this is I have no questions now. I this is it, like I just go, and. I don't know what it is. I mean, I'm thinking now with the piece I'm writing, like why do stories just arrive when I'm there? And they do. They're everywhere.
Very interesting. There's another question here, which is, I suppose, the opposite of that. You talked about very much immersed in that world. What are your thoughts about pitching? Your experience of pitching ideas. What's it like? When's it gone well? Any advice that you might have, particularly if, in future students are watching this as well? Anything about pitching?
Um, what I found extraordinary about pitching is when you try to pitch, you have to know everything. I mean, it's like reverse engineering. It's like, I mean, I can't believe the amount of work it takes to make a decent pitch. So I think maybe in my kind of experience of pitching, like at the beginning of the day of pitching, I would be like thinking, oh yeah, yeah, I'll just I can say it's a story about cracking an egg on your mother's head, and it'll be fun. And I go, that's really not enough. You know what I mean? And then so what I'm surprised by is how in depth the process of pitching is, and how when you're doing the elevator pitch, the
Yeah.
300 words where, oh my God, like it can take me weeks and weeks and weeks to get an idea which will end up being an hour down to 300 words. So I think it's there's lots to say about it, so I don't want to kind of take up too much time just talk about pitching, but I think, like, yeah, it's a lot of work, and I think it's a really interesting measurement, isn't it? Like, how much effort are you prepared to put into a pitch? Because it might never come to fruition, you know.
I think it is a really hard debate, because it's something we talk about a lot in the Writers Guild, the amount of preliminary work that writers are
Yeah,
routinely
yeah.
expected to do to pitch. Um, I suppose in the benign frame of mind that your conversation about your wonderful work has put me in, I can also see that the benefit of that is that you wouldn't want to pitch something that you do quickly, say something, and then when you get into it, realize actually this is not what I'm writing at all. So I suppose you have to know what you're doing enough to know where it might go, but it is a tricky process. Some things are easy to pitch than others, I guess.
Yeah, and also it's it's for me it's also about understanding collaboration, because it's the beginning of a collaboration. It's because if the people that you're pitching to end up becoming your producers, then that is a huge collaboration and a huge kind of dialogue, and so that's really important. And I have a friend who's an architect, and he will spend tens of thousands of pounds on a speculative project, and then and not, so he can run a business where he can be spending £100,000 a year only on pitching, and never
Wow.
and never recoup that. So I'm always going, yeah, at least I don't have to spend like £100,000 on, you know what I mean? On the anyway, so there are models out there that are equal to a writer pitching to, a big corporation or whoever. But yeah,
makes us feel a bit better. I think that puts it in perspective quite nicely when we're all complaining about our 300 words.
well, the
Um,
architects, yeah, how much they got their houses on the line, you know what I mean? It's like,
They've got their multiple houses. I just wanted to ask you about, because obviously you studied in France, you've lived abroad, and you're working in Belgium, you've worked in Germany also, have you? Yeah, or speaking German.
yeah.
How what's that experience like? How does that change what you're doing? And is there anything that surprised you or delighted you about working in other places?
Um, I mean, what's wonderful, isn't it, is understanding that stories are universal and global. That's brilliant to realize. In terms of comedy, I find it really exciting because, I think you've got the British Isles. And if you think about Britain as one place, then there is a British sense of humor. I think that obviously we try to export and big up, but I think there is a truth to that because, as a British person, you can think something's funny in France, and it isn't. And it's not just because your French is rubbish. Yeah. So the comedy, discovering what is funny in different countries and how it works, that's the most surprising and complicated and delightful process. Um, and yeah, and I feel lucky when I trained at the school in Paris, it was an international school. So, we had people from all over the world. And so learning about Japanese humor, learning about, Mexican humor, it was brilliant. And I think I've kind of carried that on. Yeah, those things, yeah.
Just what you're saying about humor there made me think something else I wanted to ask you because going back to what I was saying at the beginning about the plays that have won the Tinniswood over 20 years, that one thing they seem to have in common is that they're quite unclassifiable in terms of tone, in terms of genre, and they move around a lot. If you were asked to describe, well, I'm sure you are often asked to describe what it is you write, in terms of, is it comedy? Is it drama? Is it, I don't know, how would you, if you had to do that, how would you describe your work?
Yeah, I think the quickest way now is just to call it comedy drama.
Mm.
I think people are used to this term now, and it sort of covers a lot of bases for me. I mean, there were times when I'd say that what everything I do is comedy, but then you get into a huge conversation about what comedy is, So comedy drama, yeah, in the UK at the moment seems to fit the bill.
It's Yeah, interesting. Like I say, I find it quite frightening as well, but I think it is comedy can be quite frightening. There's another question here from a previous winner. In fact, the winner who it's Anita Sullivan who won the Tinniswood last year, and she's wondering what it meant to you to win the award. It's early days, I know, but how did it feel on the night? How are you feeling about it now?
Um, to be honest, I was really, really touched by the fact that yeah, that Steve Tinniswood was there and his siblings and yeah, his daughters and his son and I was really yeah, I think the only time I've ever really made that connection so personally with an award, and then realizing, really going, wow, this award comes from this person and this tradition and this love and passion and commitment to this form and to this world of writing. So yeah, I was surprised how much that felt wholesome and real. And yeah, so that was really, really lovely. And then the other thing I think is I think at different times, we feel obviously more or less confident about our work. And maybe sometimes we never feel fully confident. I know, doubt is a big part of what happens to us. But I, for some reason, really appreciated the validation.
Mm.
I don't know what was going on for me, but it really has helped me just calm down a little bit in terms of the world of uncertainty and doubt about what you're doing. That could have been, a post-pandemic thing. I don't know. I don't know where that's coming from, but it really helped. Or is helping now. I mean, it's only like 2 weeks ago, but just to go, oh, okay, okay. So I can settle a bit. I can put some of the doubt and uncertainty to one side. Um, yeah. So
Have
yeah.
that moment of yeah, it well deserved, and people can say, "Oh, it's great," and I liked your play, but there's something about marking it that's really great. And there's also, I'm just picking up on a comment that's in the chat from Peter about saying how, you know, that there's some painfully underrated comedy dramas, and some of which are now available. And I think what's terrific about the Tinniswood Award is it does connect us. You know, they might not all be on iPlayer, on BBC Sounds, the plays that Peter Tinniswood wrote, or the plays that have gone before, but just that feeling that you are part of a tradition, which obviously goes all the way back to their first Welsh set BBC radio play 100 years ago this year. You know, that there is a tradition which I think, because it's radio, is less visible than some other writing traditions.
Yeah.
It's not photographed. You know, you can't photograph the play. You can photograph the instance of recording. You can have photographs of the writers, but there's no images. And that, because we live in a culture that seems to, you know, we mark things visually. It's a kind of secret society in that respect.
Yeah. Yeah. No, definitely.
And the piece that you're working on now is, have you got an idea of where that's going to go? Might it become your next audio drama?
I hope so. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a series, so it's a collection of stories, and it's some like I said, it's something I've been wanting to do for a long time. And yeah, so I mean, I'd love it to be a radio series. It's all set in one town. It's called Stories from an Invisible Town, and so it's a town that I used to live in. It's an imaginary town that I used to live in as a boy, and so it's a town that nobody else could see. So yeah, so it's a collection of stories from that place. And yeah, it's about kind of real and fantastical things. It's about children hiding in shire horses. It's about people digging holes to get out of recessions. It's about a boy falling in love with twins and never being sure which one's which. You know, it's about men getting drunk and women's, you know, sort of saving them, and you know, whether kind of resenting it. Anyway, it's yeah, it's sort of, it's got a bit of everything in it. But it's really playing around with what stories do, which is penetrate the truth by being super real, and then also being, you know, telling tall stories as well. Yeah.
Fantastic. And do you have any advice for either people who are just starting to write for audio drama, or also people who maybe are at a point when it's like, oh, I just feel a bit jaded with it. The process seems so like a mountain to climb. Is there anything that you can think of, from almost like from reflecting upon it today, that you'd like to share that works for you in writing?
Like I say, I think like don't wait for inspiration, just write and trust that inspiration will come through the doing of it. That feels to me like the best advice that I've ever got. Sorry, I ever given. The best advice I've ever given. Yeah, I'm definitely a believer in writing. Like, okay, I think it was because, like I said, my wife Steffi is Swiss, and there's a writer called Dürrenmatt who is a big
Mm.
Swiss writer, and Dürrenmatt wrote this like the writer's right, and that's what you do. And so I think I've always taken that advice, you know. And it also means that when people say, have you read this, and I say no, I think you go in the back of your head, you won't say, because it sounds so pretentious, but go, I don't read, I mean, I write, that's what I do. Do you know what I mean? So I don't have time. I mean, when I hear about people who read, I'm like, where the hell do you get the time to read? And I understand they make time for it while I'm watching my films, but yeah, no, writing. And I think also it is good to share your writing in a way, right? It's lovely to have friends who are prepared to read your writing, because obviously, you know, what we all you know, find difficult, isn't it, as writers, is that we work so hard and we get so little response at times, and that's very tough. So I think building some sort of network around you is really, really good, so that you're not, you know, you're not on your own with it, because obviously writing, at the heart of writing, is all about connecting, isn't it? So it's looking
Mm.
for models in which your writing can connect to others.
In the spirit of connection, I should just say actually that the what I was asking about, about you know, advice for people. Um, Susanna asked a question about that, and she also said, which I'd like to pass on, thank you for your wonderful talk. And yeah, she's just starting to build a writing practice around working full time, also in the spirit of building connection. I just got a message from Anita just to say that Hugh, who was shortlisted, is on this call, hiding behind the artistic identity of Grace Hayden, it seems, and I can see him at the top of the screen. So hi there, Hugh. Congratulations on being shortlisted. And there may well be other people that I can't see on screen, but that's one of the things that's so nice about being able to talk to you in the context of writers together. And how do you yourself, obviously there's people in your family who make theatre, but do you have kind of meetings with writers? I mean, informally, do you have friends who are writers that you talk to about work outside your collaborators, or you know, do you network much with other writers? I don't mean that as kind of as business minded as that sounds, but do you spend a lot of time hanging with writers?
Is that a question for me? Sorry. Yeah.
Yes,
I
it is.
just
Yeah.
wasn't sure if you were bringing Hugh into it. Um, yeah, no, I mean, I think, yeah, I do. Like you say, it's not a networky thing or a business thing. It's just, we're just friends. Yeah, so I have friends who are, a couple of really good friends who are novelists, and they're super interesting because I've never written a novel. I don't really know what novels are. And, I mean, I do know what novels are. They're stories and stuff, but so yeah, no, and other playwrights as well. Yeah, and people who wouldn't call themselves writers. Like, I come from a group of friends who still do lots of improvisation and performances, and so making stories is a big part of what they do. So I do feel I'm very lucky. I feel like I'm surrounded by storytellers of different kinds, and living in Bristol is and I think probably when I was living in Cambridge, there are very strong artistic communities in both of those cities, um, which is probably why I've kind of ended up living in those two cities in the UK, because I really enjoy that.
Yes, it's like an intrinsic part of your life, that sense of storytelling. And
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And I mean, there are definitely sometimes when we will say to each other, some friends will say, when we go for a coffee tomorrow, like, can we just talk about writing?
Mm.
And that's like brilliant, let's just do that. So you don't have to go through all the, how are you? And how's the garden and all that stuff.
It's such a joy, isn't it? That on occasions when one is with writers and you don't have to talk about all of that other stuff, you can just talk about writing. I'm just going to pick up on a comment here from Kat, who was a Tinniswood judge in 2010 when Hattie Naylor's Ivan and the Dogs won. And what she's saying is that it's such a privilege to read 28 radio plays and discuss them with other writers. So I think it's something that's good to dip into. As she says, it makes you realize the sheer richness and incredible diversity of material. That being able to wallow in it, is a wonderful experience. So yeah, and
Yeah, it feels like maybe, my equivalent would be maybe going to the Edinburgh Festival, which I've done
mm,
a lot over the years. And it's exactly that. It's being able to sit down at some point during the day and be surrounded by other people who've made stuff and having seen two or three shows that day, and that accumulates over the time. So by the time you've left the festival, you might have seen 30 shows. And you're right, it's invigorating, and it's so inspiring. And also I really, really feel as well like it's so lovely to have moments when you feel part of a community. And that does feel really, really important. So kind of going back to the winning of the award, it sort of makes a community visible for a while, like this does,
mm.
or going to the BBC Awards or whatever. I think, yeah, I'm really encouraged by being able to see who the community is and build those friendships actually.
It's definitely something that on the audio committee that we're keen to do more of. And just picking up on Meg's point earlier about the commissioning process, I think things being what they are, there's so many situations which writers are having to compete with one another, and there's like smaller kind of pots of money, and it can become quite fraught. And it's good just to kind of hang out and chat and remember that we've got more in common than not, and we entertain one another and everything.
Yeah, and also, the thing is like, because I suppose I've been around for like a little while, like sometimes one thing won't be commissioned like one year, but 3 years later, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's to remember that. That's why I think, it's a lot, I think it's a long ball game, I think we're so driven by the time and the fashion of what's going on that I think there is that aspect, isn't there, to commissioning, and that frustrating thing of they're looking for the next I know, Ladhood, or
Yeah,
there'll
yeah.
be Succession's been a great drama. We need to have another Succession. You go, oh my God, yeah, it can drive you mad. So
Yes. No, it can do. It can do. And not in a good way either. Um, so I think we're coming to the end of our time. My God, because at that time already. I'm If anybody's got any final questions, please do pop them in the chat in the next couple of minutes. And I think most people here are probably Writers Guild members, but a lot of you who will be watching online won't necessarily be Writers Guild members. So you can sign up to receive the newsletter to find out more things that are going on. You can check the website to find out future events. You can join, obviously, which there is many benefits for. And check our social media. I'm just looking here. Great. So I think there isn't any more questions, but is there anything that you would just finally like to, anything that's kind of that you've been thinking about doing this, or that you'd like to add, or what your favorite walk is when you're in Anglesey, or anything that comes to mind?
oh wow. Well, my favorite walk on Anglesey is absolutely the walk along Llandwyn Beach, which is down in Newbuch, which is Newborough. And yeah, the walk is a long sandy beach that runs over a mile down to Lovers Island, where there's a beautiful, small, perfectly scaled lighthouse and a tiny bay where you can take your clothes off and go swimming. And it overlooks the Menai Straits, and in the distance you see the Snowdonian mountain range. And it's the best place on earth. It's just so beautiful. So that is an easy one to answer. And the other thing I'd like to say is that, a really big thank you, which I was trying to say at the beginning, for the invitation to do this, and obviously a huge thank you to the Tinniswood Award and to the Tinniswood family and everybody who supports the award. Because the other thing is, I mean, is that it also comes with a £3,000 prize money as well, which is so rare. So going back to the reality of life, like I think the award is, yeah. Anyway, that's a wonderful aspect which I think just needs to be sort of shouted about. That it's a generous award. It's a very generous award, and so a really big thank you to the Tinniswood Award for that generosity, because it's, as we all know, I mean, that's super helpful. That money will stretch in time and help more words to arrive on the page. And thanks to everyone for attending to again make us all feel together that there is a lot of us out there, and we can connect and listen to each other and hopefully, help each other, and etc. etc. So it's been lovely to do this. So thank you. And thank you for the questions. You've made it really easy to just chat. So I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Good. Oh, lovely. Well, there's loads of thanks coming through in the chat, and just like to echo that and say thank you, everybody who came, and let's keep that spirit of generosity and storytelling going, and see you all again.